Now coming to the stage next. Are you ready? I know that Amos Wilson Collective, whew, I know that got you full. We ain't ready to pop that top button quite yet, but I know you was eating good. We're gonna serve some lunch up here in just a little bit. We have plenty of physical food, but we also have that mental food, that mental diet to get you feeding on that which enriches your mind, not just your mind, but also your soul and your spirit. Are you ready? Yes, sir. Oh, I got something for you now, because this brother right here, I'm gonna be honest and say that this brother and this group, I really have an admiration for. And I'm not the type of person that you say brown nose or kisses up. I'm not that type of brother. This is a intellectual body, a think tank that they call Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This brother Dayvon Love is going to lead this with his comrades, how to win against media assaults on our humanity. Dayvon Love is a Baltimore-based political organizer and the director of public policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank. Think about that. Let me say that. A grassroots think tank that advances the public policy interests of black people. This is a winning team, family. I told you, I don't brown. I'm accustomed, inclined to winners. I do. I have a tendency to like those that win. So why not like those that win on our behalf? Are you with me? Put your hands together for our brother and your brother, Dayvon Love, and the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Thank you, brother.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about this piece around how to win against media assaults on our humanity. But I want to start a little bit by saying something about my organization, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and how we were founded. Many of us come out of high school and college policy debate. It is the rigorous form of academic debate that exists. And I happen to come into the activity during an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity that centered the use of cultural identity and social justice in a way that countered the very elite white activity of policy debate. And many of the people that came out of that activity ended up going into major public policy institutions and entities, right? And so when we were finished with the activity of debate, we looked around and noticed that many of the folks that were advocating on issues that impacted black folks were not people that are of and from our community, right? They might be well-meaning, right? But they weren't people for whom the basis of their credibility, right, and the basis of, their ability to have standing in our community came from our folks. And so we founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle in 2010 with that in mind. And one of the things that I think many of us are socialized to think about when we talk about policy is that many people who engage the policy arena, there's an assumption that you have to believe in this society, you have to believe in America in order to engage the policy arena. And one of the things that we're clear about is that as a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist organization, we needed to have a presence in the policy arena. And that many people that engage in a larger policy landscape, right, have a belief that we have to acquiesce to the status quo as a part of how we operate. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that as an organization, we've been able to have influence over the political arena in a way where the source of our power is black people. Too often in the political landscape, because, again, we're socialized to see it as a site of assimilation, we have ceded the field of the political arena to our enemies, right? And so there aren't enough folks in the political landscape engaged in policy advocacy from a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective. And what I'll add to that is that when I think about many of the scholars who were mentioned previously, who've been mentioned throughout the conversations throughout this conference, and I'm thinking particularly about Derek Bell, one of the founding theoreticians of critical race theory. And one concept that is essential in his scholarly production is this notion of the permanence of racism and white supremacy. See, we're clear that we're not trying to make America a better place. We're not trying to make white people, better people. And in fact, much of the historiography that we have about the extent to which black people have made progress is to the extent to which we petition white people to recognize our humanity. And that historiography is incorrect. Like when you think about what is the basis for the progress that black folks have made in this society, it is only to the extent that we've engaged in sovereign, self-determined political activity as the basis for our advancement. So whether you're talking about the Haitian Revolution, right, that really set the stage, it wasn't, well-meaning, sympathetic white folks that decided that they just wanted to end enslavement, right? It was the black folks, Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who decided that black people were going to be free and fight against the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And that inspired Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, right? And that created a context where it was in the interest of white folks, particularly in the North, it was in their interest to capitulate to the demands of people of African descent. So I wanted to start with that because when we talk about what it means to be a person of African descent in the society, we are prisoners of war, right? And we have to be clear that this is a society that has been in a 500-year war against the humanity of people of African descent. And that 500-year-old war has taken a variety of different iterations. So I'm going to talk about a handful of those to start, and then I'll get in to talk more specifically about political advocacy and media. One of the things I've always found really fascinating is this notion of the field of Egyptology. Egyptology emerges as an academic discipline during what's called the Enlightenment period, specifically to theorize Egypt out of Africa, right? Because the idea being that, because they couldn't deny the civilizational advanced society, right, that ancient Egypt was, or Kemet was, right? So they had to theorize, and many of you have heard this notion, Egypt not being a part of Africa. It really wasn't until 1974 where the mainstream, historical scholars were forced to acknowledge that culturally, Kemet, its cultural basis is from black folks in the South, right, the top of the Nile Valley. And we have to think about the fact that this notion of Egyptology, right, and theorizing Egypt out of Africa, the notion being that if you take away this belief, or if you impose, rather, this belief that people of African descent have not operated in arenas marked as high levels of civilization, then it's easy to justify notions of black inferiority. It is easier to humanize people of African descent if they have been taken off the respectful commentary of human history. So, starting with that as a foundation, and really the foundation of Western civilization is the dehumanization of people of African descent. I think we have to then look at what is the impact that has on us materially, right? Because the history is important, us understanding and knowing the history is important, but what is the material impact of those historical currents? So I'll give one example that's most relevant to what I'm going to talk about this morning. Kelly Miller is a scholar. He actually was one of the first black people to attend Johns Hopkins. He didn't finish. He eventually was one of the founders of the African, the ASA, the African Studies Academy, with people like Alexander Crummell and a few others. And one of the things that he writes in a collection of essays in 1909, he's critical of a black scholar who, during this period of time, this is right after Reconstruction, wrote a book defaming people of African descent. And a part of what he says is that as a result of black people achieving freedom, that there was a crime wave. And the book of the person he's refuting actually provides data points to justify this claim that freedom of black people produced more crime. One of the data points that Kelly Miller identifies that is in this book is that, black people in the North, where there's more freedom, commit more crime than black people in the South, right? So that was the argument that this scholar used to justify it. And what Kelly Miller argues, and as he's a sociologist, so one of the things that he goes to refute it, he says that in the South, because of the extra legal activity, where there was lynching, there was more extra legal activity in the South. What he argues is that, in fact, what we consider crime, white folks took into their own hands, right? So it skews the numbers that if you say there's more black people committing crime in the North, right, because they're free, but those that would be considered crime in the South wouldn't be recorded anywhere, right? Because this is where you get many of the lynchings. So I use that quote, and there's a publication that we put out earlier this year called Fear of a Black Planet, where we start with that quote. Because for us, it's important to provide some of the social scientific refutation of these notions of black criminality, right? We have to provide the refutations necessary to combat those notions. So I want to talk about some of the cultural mythologies that this society has propagated and talk about its impact on policy, right? Because there are ways that these cultural mythologies that's injected into us and it impacts us as a people. But I want to talk specifically about how many of these cultural mythologies impact policies that are weaponized against our community. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with the war on drugs, mass incarceration. So I'm going to talk a lot about that, but again, specific in the context of particular cultural mythologies. So I'm going to talk about two. The first is there's a book called Medical Apartheid. There's a section, Harriet Washington, where she talks about, in particularly in the 80s and the 90s, this notion of a crack baby, right? I'm pretty sure that's a term people have heard before, right? And I'm pretty sure many of us remember being kids or being younger and like jokingly calling each other crack babies, right? Which again shows the pervasiveness of how these cultural mythologies we're injected with those perspectives. What's interesting about that notion, though, is Harriet Washington, she's a medical journalist. And one of the things that she ends that section with is there's actually no such medical entity as a crack baby, right? There's no discernible medical difference between a person who's born to a mother who's addicted to alcohol or other drugs than crack. So what's the importance of crack, right? Crack was culturally coded as a sign of black pathology. And that anything that was proximate to, that overlapped with crack, right, they wanted to associate black people with that, right? And so I start with that because what is the purpose then of peddling a concept that has no medical basis? And I argue that in many respects, it was the cultural mythology that was necessary to advance the policies of the war on drugs, right? That you don't get the mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out. You don't get those policies without having to convince people that you need a level of extreme discipline, punishment, in order to get at these people that are inherently inferior and pathological. So if you have us joking with each other, calling each other crack babies, it's easy then to justify that these are the kind of policies that we need. And one of the things that's often, I think, a mistake as to how we narrate the war on drugs era, we blame Clinton and Biden, and they sure have their role. They were leaders of the political effort when we talk about the crime bill in 1994. But we have to remember that it was many black elected officials who were pushing and supported, right, the crime bill and many of these tough on crime policies in the name of addressing public safety and crime in our community, right? In fact, I remember during the 2016 presidential election watching Bobby Rush, who was a former member of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, who was a congressman, who got on TV and apologized for the role he played in voting for the crime bill in 94. Right, so these are folks that ostensibly know better, right? But the cultural mythologies were so strong, right, that it created a context where those policies could be perpetuated. All right, the second stigma that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk pretty in depth about this particular one, because I think it is essential in the area where folks are talking about pushing back against mass incarceration, pushing back against the criminalization of black men and boys. It is a trope and a notion that is so central, but I think it is avoided for a variety of reasons that I'll get to. The white progressive co-option of criminal justice reform and fight against mass incarceration has left us centering the notion of the nonviolent drug offender. And many people, when you hear criminal justice reform, you'll hear people talk about sympathy for the nonviolent drug offender. Now, anybody that knows and that looks at the data in terms of the people that are being touched by the criminal justice system, by the war on drugs, right? Drugs was a proxy for violent crime. When people talked about drugs, the war on drugs policy, those are the proponents of it. They were talking about it in the context of stopping violent crime in the community. So centering this notion of the nonviolent drug offender, in many respects, was a way to talk about some of the clear policy challenges of the war on drugs, while in some ways distancing themselves from the people that were most impacted by the war on drugs. Namely, when you think about the trope of the drug dealer. There's a way that, and again, one of the challenges in our society, the notion of respectability politics, where there are certain people that we won't try to understand them as human beings, right? There's a way that this society has black people with the internalization of notions of black inferiority, that we run away from people that trigger notions that inflame those beliefs of black inferiority. And it's my argument that the notion of the drug dealer is a part of that. Because if we're all honest, we got nephews, cousins, uncles, right? And there's a way that when we think about the media depictions of a drug dealer, right? The media depictions of a drug dealer is someone who has a thirst for violence and community destruction. Now, let's be clear, there were definitely folks in our community that were that. But many of us know people that were engaged in the drug trade that did it because they felt like they had to. And if we're serious, the biggest access to capital that many of us had in our community was the illicit drug market. So there's a way that our community has been afraid to take seriously the fact that there are folks in our community that engage in the drug trade out of a need, out of a desire, given the lack of skills they were able to get in the education system, given the lack of opportunities. There's a way that notion of the drug dealer is still so stigmatized, right, that we won't acknowledge the fact that many of them are folks that want to do good in the community, but weren't given access to the opportunities or resources to do so, and fell into something that many of us, and even many of them, would otherwise want to do something else, right? The reason why that's so important and why that stigma is so central, even if you think about like it as a cash market, like why is drug dealing so violent? And if we think about it, in a cash market, you can't call the police if somebody robs you, right? So many of them carry firearms because that is the way that they protect themselves in doing whatever business that they're doing, right? What that gets turned into is that these are people that are prone to violence. So we make them out to be people who are inherently violent. And again, those of us that have relatives or people who we love that have been engaged in that, many of us know better than that. But again, it's not something that is fashionable to talk about in public. The reason why that trope is so important from a policy perspective is because the way that the policies are written as it relates to black men and boys is that every young boy is a potential drug dealer. And all of the tropes that is projected onto that, right, becomes the direction in which policy is made. Or said differently, that black boys in this society, every day of our lives of having to prove that we're not that. And the policies are written in such a way. So one example of what I mean by that is that in communities that if you grow up in certain communities that are unsafe, where you know that people carry firearms for protection, what happens is that, and the way the policies are written, there's now a new criminalization of mere gun possession, where just having a gun makes you someone that is prone to violence. But again, if you know people in our community, folks will say, I carry it because I know they have it. And I don't want to, right? That's not something that I prefer to do, but I know they have it. But policies are being made in such a way where that person is a potential drug dealer, right? And that our policies are done in such a way where that person is treated the same as a person that wants to do harm to our community, right? So these cultural mythologies are essential in thinking about the nature of the kind of policies that are made, because those cultural mythologies then serve as the logic for why policies that we might otherwise think are problematic are things, so again, going back to the 94 crime bill, right, that one would think mandatory minimum sentences for gun possession would be good in stopping violence. But if I actually cared about humanity of black men and boys, and I actually studied the life that black men and boys were actually living under, I wouldn't make a policy that would make it so that if I just merely catch you with a gun, you're going to do a mandatory sentence of 5 or 10 years, right? If you cared about the humanity of black men and boys, right? But it is an example, again, of how these cultural mythologies impact our policies. So that's a lot of what we're dealing with today. So I mentioned mandatory minimums, the criminalization of gun possession. And one of the things, as my sister, Ms. Gwen mentioned earlier, there's also what we're dealing with now is kind of a exacerbation of the propaganda that now is, particularly in Baltimore City, right, but really across the state of Maryland, that is creating these notions that there's a level of violence that is happening, particularly with black youth. So think about this, right? 7% of all the crime committed in this state are committed by young people. But if you watch the news, you would think the majority of it is, because that's so much of what is reported in the news currently, right? And we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose and the impact, right, of that propaganda, right? The impact of that propaganda is that it created a context where our state legislature made a decision to push forward a juvenile justice bill, right, that would expand the jurisdiction of the Department of Juvenile Justice to 10 and 12-year-olds, right, based on no data, but propaganda. And what happened was you had a lot of people who were calling their legislators, saying we want harsher policies. One of my mentors, Senator Jill Carter, who represents Baltimore City, was a primary target of Fox 45 and Sinclair Broadcasting because she was the primary sponsor of many of the bills where they were attempting to roll back the way that the criminal justice system was being weaponized against our community, right? Primarily, you think about this piece of legislation, the Child Interrogation Protection Act, right? Which for us is like real baseline. A custodial interrogation of a young person, a parent should be notified, and an attorney consulted, right? But this is something that Fox 45 has criminalized and has used law enforcement to say that this impacts their ability to do public safety, right? And so there was a kind of constant attack against Senator Carter, right? Where the news would essentially prop up these individual stories. And this is one of the things that's important to know about the way that media and propaganda operates, is that they take the most extreme examples and they show you those extreme examples over and over again, such that you believe that that's commonplace. When in fact, many of the stories they show you are the stories that are the outlier, right? So that's a part of how that propaganda operates. But what that does is that then legislators legislate to the extremes, right? And then, so as I mentioned, people will call their elected officials and tell them we need harsher policies on these young people, right, because of this kind of surge in what they call juvenile crime. Another thing that we've been working on, and many folks in this room will be working on this coming legislative session, is around stopping the automatic charging of youth as adults, right? So currently in the state of Maryland, there's a slew of charges that if a young person is charged with, they automatically go into the adult system. It's our belief that they should start in the juvenile system where they get access to services. Because what happens is you have young people that spend, and about 2/3 of the young people that are put in the adult system are waved down anyway. So you have a bunch of young people that spend months in the adult system with the kind of dehumanization that happens to them in that system, right? That, to me, is another common sense thing. Why would that be so difficult to pass? Because the propaganda has created a context where many of us believe that our community, that black men and boys, are an inherent danger to the community and that they deserve the kind of treatment in the adult system, right? That's, I would argue, the essential underlying current of that thinking. So those are some of the policies that we're dealing with today. And one of the things that, for me, has been important to remind people, because there are times when we can adopt a narrative where we're always losing. That even when these policies come through, we can adopt a narrative that we're not making progress. So what I actually want to take the balance of my time to do is to actually talk about the ways that black people have, in this current moment, been able to push back against these kind of cultural mythologies and propaganda against black men and boys in ways that we build on, right? Because those victories are important in inspiring ourselves in the community to be engaged in this fight for the humanity of black men and boys. So I want to start with, so I talked briefly for a few moments ago about Sinclair Broadcasting and Fox 45. So my organization has been very active and vocal. It's a guy named David Smith, wealthy white billionaire, who owns Sinclair Broadcasting, Fox 45. And it is very clear to us and many people that he wants to control Baltimore City, and he's using his money to do so, and he's using his media outlets to do so. He actually also became co-owner of the Baltimore Sun, right, which is the paper of record, consolidating his ability to put out these narratives. And so we've been very intentional about calling out, pushing back against David Smith and many of the efforts that he's pushing forward. So much so that we actually received a cease and desist letter, right, from Sinclair Broadcasting. And what was interesting is that in the letter that we were sent, because we did an event last week, pushing back against a ballot initiative that he funded to put on the ballot to reduce the size of our city council. Because if our city council is reduced, he'd have more ability to control the people in the city council. And so we, in our event description, described it as an attempt to diminish black political power. And according to the letter we got, that verbiage they thought was besmirching the character, right, of their company. Which to me is kind of astounding given the fact they spent all this time besmirching and denigrating the image of black people, right, in Baltimore City. But the fact that for them was something that was the line too far, to me demonstrates the fact that they feel threatened by the fact that there are black people that are going to stand up and talk about the importance of black political power representation as a counter to his attempt to seek power in Baltimore City. In addition to that, he tried to buy our local elections. So former Mayor Sheila Dixon, who had run several times for mayor, was bankrolled, right, by Sinclair Broadcasting. And whatever you think about her as a political figure, it was very clear to many of us, a lot of folks that had known her for a long time, it was clear that the campaign of Sheila Dixon, the 2024 campaign, was about Sinclair Broadcasting seeking to take control, right? They lost, right? And that was important, right? There were several council members who were supporters, particularly as one gentleman, Eric Costello, councilman of the 11th district, right, who represents downtown, and one of Sinclair Broadcasting's biggest cheerleaders. And many of us thought, actually, because he represents downtown, many of us thought that he wasn't going to lose because his constituents were, downtown. He lost, right? So what that tells me is that the work that people are doing to push back and call out Sinclair Broadcasting has allowed us to be able to not only just push back in terms of the rhetoric and the conversation, but actually had real material political results and impacts, right? So that piece is important. Additionally, I mentioned before the juvenile justice bill, right, that was moved this past session. Now, it's important that we give, again, many of the people in this room that worked to weaken the bill that ultimately passed, right? Because the bill, as it was introduced, was a bill that was much more harmful to our community than what ultimately passed, right? And that was then as a result of many people in this room pushing back to ensure that the damage from that piece of legislation was weakened. So it's important for us to acknowledge that. But I would also say, in addition to that, one of the things that we have to be clear about is that these kind of internalized notions of black criminality are things that we have to talk to our own community about. Because one of the things that LBS has been very clear about is that one of the efforts that we've supported is the importance of investing in community-based violence prevention. And one of the things that we've done, because we don't want to rely on law enforcement for us to have safety in our community. In Baltimore, the police department says they're about 400 or 500 police officers short. They have a shortage. What has also happened simultaneously is some of the largest declines in homicide and non-fatal shooting in the past 40 to 50 years. What that means is that it wasn't law enforcement that was the centerpiece in producing more safety in our community. It was the investment in community-based violence prevention, right? That include, folks like We Are Us, right? The NOI, right? Baltimore Brothers, right? We Are Us, Challenge to Change, Tendea, all these local grassroots organizations that played a role in providing safety to our community in a way that we didn't need to rely on law enforcement. That is a tremendous victory, because what Sinclair and Fox 45 will want you to believe is that we need law enforcement to have safety, right? But what Baltimore has proven is that we can produce safety from our community, right? And so when we think about this juvenile justice bill that passed this past session and our own power and influence, I was actually talking on the phone the other day to a friend of mine's, a brother, Malcolm Ruff, who's a delegate, represents the 41st Legislative District. And we were talking about the juvenile justice bill. And one of the things that he told me that I didn't know was that there were a handful of black legislators who actually, when the bill came up to be voted on, because they felt pressure from leadership to vote for the bill, but there were a few of them that actually left the floor, right? And it's one of those kind of wonky, legislative things where instead of actually taking a vote on it, yes or no, because being on the record is something people can use against you in an election, many of them walked off of the floor. And I knew that there were a few of them that did that, but I looked at the name. There was about almost a dozen black elected officials who walked off of the floor so they wouldn't have to vote for the bill or against it. And to me, that's important to know, because I think some of us, even though the bill passed, it's important to know that there were those in our community that recognized the power of black folks and recognized that they would be punished electorally and by our community by supporting the bill, right? So for me, that's something to build on. But we build on the fact that there were folks that were afraid enough to walk off of the floor instead of having to vote for or against it, right? So again, I just wanted to say that when we talk about the media has an impact on our community, how we think. It's important for us to talk to our community so that they know the things that Fox 45 or the media in general won't tell us. And it's important for us to tell those stories, in addition to the fact that they should know, but that it impacts the movement of policy, right? Because if people are going around calling each other crack babies, it's going to be easy to do mandatory minimums, right? If we're going around saying that there's this surge in quote-unquote juvenile crime and these young people out of control, it's easy for them to shrink the capacity for diversion, right? And to make it so that our young people are drawn to the criminal justice system, right? So those stories and those narratives are important in policy. And I think for the work that many of us in this room have done, we've been doing that work. And again, the examples I gave are examples of how that work has been effective. There's still more to do, but it demonstrates the power that our community has to win on these issues. And my hope is that this will be the kind of building blocks to win even more, in the coming legislative session. So I'll stop there, take any questions people got.
All right, family, come on, put your hands together for Brother Dayvon Love and the leaders of a beautiful struggle. Do we have any questions at this time? Any questions? I see one. Do we have any others? I see two. I see three. I'm going to ask again that you make your questions and that you answer them directly for the sake of time. Thank you.
Powerful piece, Brother Dayvon. Thank you for that. Man, it's got my head spinning on.
I'm sorry. I've been instructed to ask you to stand up.
Oh, stand up. Okay.
Thank you.
Stand up. Yes. So my question is the media is not going anywhere, and we know there's an influence on social media. How do we disrupt that so it doesn't continue to nurture cultural mythologies that you talked about, how do we disrupt that or control that or influence that?
Well, I think when you think about just our people, there's a way that I think sometimes we overestimate the ability of social media to impact us culturally. If you think about who are the people that are most influential in your life, right? There's certain people that if you're looking to on certain issues, I'm gonna look to so-and-so, right? And so for me, that's a strength of our community. So I think a part of the pushing back is being really intentional about going to those folks in our community that have strong networks, right? Strong social networks who are leaders in the community, and have them be kind of ambassadors for certain messages. Because what we found is that our ability to push back has come from the fact that we're connected, right, to Black folks that have that level of influence, so that when we talk about Sinclair Broadcasting and they see it, right, we've already talked to a bunch of people, right? And so one of the things that we've actually experienced is that people will come and say, oh, I see what you're talking about now, right? And they're telling other people. So I would just say for us to be clear about the power we have in the networks that we have in our community, and even though media is influential, we can counter it.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zola Shaw, and I'm a Rockville City Council member. I was recently elected last year. My question is about how do you raise and uplift community stories, and within that process, push back on narratives, as well as building community power?
You know, one of the things that I try to model, because one of the things the media would have us believe is that ain't nobody doing nothing. Like, that's something, sometimes you walking on the street, some people just say ain't nobody doing nothing. And part of the problem is that our media doesn't help us know that folks are doing a wide range of things, right? So I would say a part of it is us acclimating ourselves to what people are doing. And the only way really to do that is you got to be outside, right? You got to go to stuff, you got to meet people where things are happening. And I think when we do that, there's a credibility when a person can say, I went to their thing, I went to their event, I saw the young people that they impacted. There's something more powerful about that. But again, I think it requires people to like be outside, be around the people that are having those impacts to be able to speak directly to it.
Oh, I see another hand. Go ahead, stand up for us, please.
Hello, thank you, Brother Dayvon. I'm Crystal. I work in policy making in the state's juvenile justice system, and so completely agree with you. House Bill 814, that's the juvenile justice bill, was terrible. A question I have for you is, when you look at the Black legislators who chose to vote for the bill or were in leadership and enabled the bill's creation, and you're looking to future efforts in the General Assembly, for example, the youth charges adults bill that you want to basically ban that practice. How immovable do you think those legislators are? How persuadable do you find them to be? And what pressure points are you looking to with those Black legislators?
You got some serious questions right there, brother.
Yes,
you
yes,
get
sir.
all that?
Got it. So one of the things that I didn't mention at the top of my presentation that I think will be important to say as the kind of preface for your question, politics is warfare without the bloodshed. Warfare is politics that's spilled out of the back room. We have to think about politics as a site of warfare. And part of the challenge sometimes is that we want elected officials to be kind of morally righteous people. It is my belief that I trust more when I can make you do something, as opposed to hoping that you do, right? And that's different in terms of how people relate to the political arena, because again, we want to seek out leaders that we believe in, that we want to support. So I say that as a preface to your question, because when we talk about persuading them, I would say it a little different. I would say that we need to be able to address them in ways where they can feel the electoral, social, political consequences of them not doing what we tell them they need to do, right? And so one of the things that we got to be clear about, because making moral appeals to them, right, what we need to do, though, is what are the things that impact them? And what impacts them is their electability, right? So I think there's work to do in going into their districts. And a lot of times, many of these local races, the vast majority of people don't participate. In a state that's a Democratic Party stronghold, participation in the primaries is extremely low, right? And so really the majority of the people in those districts don't know, right, what their elected officials are doing. So I think some of the work is going into those districts, right, being able to tell people what's happening, get people motivated to participate, because when elected officials see that, they get scared, And then the conversation then is different. It's no longer about, please, the conversation becomes, how do you want this next election for yourself to go, right? And that's just the way that we have to deal, even though they are people, they're black, that's fine, right? But given the fact that politics is warfare, right, we have to treat it that way.
Good answer, good answer. Go one more question for you. If you stand up, please.
Yes, I will. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. All the things that you have talked about take people and money. And we've talked about yesterday the burdens that we all have, the difficulties. Lots of times our organizations depend on the same government to fund the grants that then burden us with the reporting that then keep us from doing the work. If you could design it the way it should be and help us help each other to change it, what would you do? I would love to say we could all self-fund. I don't see that happening.
So that's a huge question. I'll do a few parts of it, but that's a really huge question. In some ways, that's a fundamental challenge, right? It's a fundamental challenge for our community. I'll say a couple of things. The first is that I think we need to have more, and I think, again, a lot of people in this room have some fundamental clarity about where we are in the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is some of our people are more aligned to the direct services aspect of the work. They work directly with our community. It's important that we don't burden them with also the political work, right? And there's certain things that an organization or folks that are in the direct services lane, we don't need them necessarily taking some of those political risks, right? So part of it is just have an ecosystem we know people's role. Everybody doesn't have to take the kind of political stance that we take, right? So LBS, our role is that. And in some ways, that is the role we take so that other organizations can play their role more acutely, right? So that's one piece of it. The other part of it is that, and again, I'll talk about direct services. One of the things that we've been super passionate about for many years is the human social service sector. So public health, social work, public education, out of school time. There are a variety of different industries that in essence are profiteering off the suffering of black people. Right? Like their whole careers, organizations that are produced for the purpose of this kind of missionary desire to fix black people. Then in many respects, it is a jobs program for mediocre white folks, right? Because imagine how arrogant is it that a person believes that they can help a people they know nothing about? Like what other context did you go into a community not know anything about the history and culture and claim to be of service to that community? And I say that there's a human social service sector full of those people. So I think that there is a unique opportunity, I think, for those of us in the political arena, those of us that provide services, to seize resources in the public sector in a very strategic way. Because I think there's a way that like public dollars can be more onerous. But what we don't think about is what would it mean to wield the kind of power where we have the people in seats of government that'll dictate, right, what the rules are. One example I'll give is some of the work that we've done on reparations for the war on drugs, right? And one of the things that we were able to do in jurisdictions around the state, there was this knee-jerk thought that the monies, so what we're able to do is 35% of the tax revenues from recreational cannabis goes into a fund. Each jurisdiction gets a percentage of that fund determined by that jurisdiction's contribution to statewide cannabis possession charges, right? So jurisdictions hit the hardest, get the most money. And so we were able, and each jurisdiction has to pass a law that determines how they spend their portion of it. And so we worked, in a variety of jurisdictions around the state, including Montgomery County, to do that. And one of the things that we had to do was the knee-jerk response was to include, to say that the monies would fund nonprofits. And we were very clear to remove that language because the idea being that if the government is able to make it so that there was a broad ability to use those resources for our community, it can be a source of revenue, right, for folks in our community. I think part of the challenge is sometimes when we think about our relationship to public dollars, we think that it's the same as like a private foundation. But I think as black people, the reality is our greatest access to capital is the public sector. And if we seize power in the public sector, we can seize those resources to fund our work, right? Now, it does require navigating the political arena Because in some of the work that we've done, I mentioned just our reparations for the war and drugs work. We did some work in Baltimore City around the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund, where we were fortunate enough to be able to pressure the government to even change the MOU between the youth fund and the city, right? They had like certain auditing requirements that we were able to remove from the MOU, right? And so that's the kind of work in terms of seizing resources from the public sector that I think could fund the work. But again, it requires a mind shift change because again, in the political arena, if we take power and seize it, then we can wield it that way to resource ourselves the same way as I mentioned before, all these mediocre white people are using human social services to fund their livelihoods in ways that really should be going into our community.
Man, put your hands together for Dayvon Love.